The 2023 NFL season did not end well for many NFL teams. However, some of them have actually improved tremendously over the offseason and have actually put together a great start to the 2024 season. So in today's video, I want to talk about the top 5 most improved teams compared to what they did last year. So as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about the top 5 NFL teams that have improved the most from their 2023 season. Before I actually hop into my top 5 list, I do want to hand out one honorable mention, and that's going to go to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, I know they made the playoffs last year, but they weren't a great regular season team. They finished, I think, with 9 wins last year, and currently, as we sit here today, I think they're probably going to win easily double-digit wins this year. They couldn't crack my top 5 because I feel like there's a couple teams who earned those spots a little bit more, but I did want to give some credit to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers for what has been a great start to their season. But with that said, if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, but let's get into it. And we are going to begin with, at number 5, the Los Angeles Chargers. So far, the LA Chargers are 3-2, have given up only 66 points this season while putting up 91 for themselves. Now, admittedly speaking, I do feel like this offense has maybe taken a small step back from where they were last year, but that was kind of to be expected when you lost guys like Austin Eckler, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, and so many other great players offensively. It was sort of bound that this offense would take a step back. So far this season, they're only putting up 18.2 points per game, which puts them at number 26 in the NFL, 281 yards per game, which puts them at number 28, and they're only averaging 1.8 touchdowns per game, which is the 27th best in the NFL. But I feel like the reason why this team has improved so much, at least in my opinion, is because this defense has been surprisingly awesome this year. They rank number 1 in opponents' points per game, number 6 in opponents' yards per game, number 1 in opponents' touchdowns per game, number 8 in opponents' yards per play, and number 2 in opponents' points per play. Given the fact this was a defense in 2023 that I wouldn't say was bad, but definitely was not top 10, at least in my books, I think it's pretty safe to say that thus far through the season, this LA Chargers defense has been not only surprising, but one of the better defenses out there. Now, I do think it is important that we add a little bit of some context to those numbers, because admittedly speaking, this defense hasn't been tremendously tested so far. In week 1, you went up against the Las Vegas Raiders, who we all know have a terrible offense. However, they held them to just 10 points. Then in week 2, you went up against Bryce Young, and yeah, that team only scored 3 points. Then you had the Steelers, who dropped 20 on you. Again, that Steelers offense is okay, but not great. Then you had probably your biggest test of the season, and even though you lost, you held that Chiefs team to only 17 points. So for this Chargers team, given the fact that you haven't gone up against a great offense, you've made all these offenses look really bad. And the best offense that you've gone up against, which would be the Kansas City Chiefs, you held them to less than 20 points. Now, fortunately for this Chargers team, if you look at the remainder of their schedule, they actually kind of have a favorable schedule, because next week on Monday, you have the Arizona Cardinals. That is a good offense, so if you can hold that offense to less than like 24 points, I feel like that is kind of a validating effort for what your defense has done so far. Then after that, you have the Saints, who at that point might have Spencer Rattler still as their quarterback. That's not a great offense. Then you got the Browns, the Titans. Then after that, you have about a 5-game stretch with some tough opponents in the Bengals, Ravens, Falcons, Chiefs, and Buccaneers. In my opinion, that is going to be a massive test for this team to kind of see where they're at around these other playoff contenders. Then you're going to end the season off with the Broncos, Patriots, and the Raiders. So as you can see, outside of that big stretch of tough games, this is a really favorable schedule that I think really does get this Chargers team to a point where they could potentially make the playoffs. And given the fact this was a Chargers team that missed the playoffs last year, gave up 63 points to the Raiders, they've looked pretty good so far, and I think that this offense is starting to get going a little bit, and if they make a trade for some receiver out there, I feel like this Chargers team took a massive step forward. However, coming in at number 4 is going to be the Atlanta Falcons. Now, coming into this season, I had very high expectations for this Falcons team. I thought that they could easily be one of the best teams in the NFC, and that they should have been one of the favorites to win their division. And so far through the 6 games they've played, I would say they've lived up to my expectations. They're currently 4-2. They are tied with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, actually have the tiebreaker over the Buccaneers, which could loom large later in the season. They've scored 149 points this season while only giving up 135, and they've looked pretty solid on the eye test as well. Statistically speaking, they rank number 11 in points per game, number 8 in yards per game, and number 14 in touchdowns per game. And defensively, they rank number 15 in opponents' points per game, 17 in opponents' yards per game, and number 9 in opponents' touchdowns per game. And when you look at what they've been tested with so far this season, they've had some really tough tests that they've, for the most part, passed. In week 1, obviously that was Kirk Cousins' first game coming off the torn Achilles, so I didn't take too much from that game. Obviously you lost to a pretty solid Pittsburgh team. But then since that game, you've won 4 of your last 5. You beat the Eagles in pretty dramatic fashion. Offense started to look better in that game. Then after that, you lost to the Kansas City Chiefs, but you still looked good and were very competitive with a team that I think currently is one of the favorites to win the Super Bowl. Then after that, you beat up on the Falcons, then after that Chiefs game, you went in and beat the New Orleans Saints, who, by the way, at that point were still thought of as a pretty good team. Then you went in there, dropped 500 yards on the Buccaneers, and then last week you beat the Carolina Panthers. So while I'm not sitting here and going to tell you guys that I think this Falcons team is the best team in the NFC or even a Super Bowl contender by any means, I do feel like this Falcons team is starting to get into a groove and playing like one of the better teams in the NFC. I still feel as if this Falcons team has a very legitimate shot to actually make the playoffs and to win their division. And given the fact that my expectations were pretty high, I feel like they've lived up to those expectations, at least so far. Again, this is a Falcons team that for the past 3 seasons has continuously been pretty mediocre and hasn't been able to take that next step into making the playoffs. And given what I've seen these past 3 weeks with the offense playing very well and the defense playing also some pretty good football, it makes me feel pretty confident that this team is going to be able to break out of that consistent just losing spirit and become one of the best teams in the league. When you look at their remaining schedule, they do have some tough matchups, but I feel like they're going to be favored in a lot of these games. Next week, you have Seattle, and I think the Falcons have a great shot in that one. You got the Buccaneers rematch, which should be awesome. Then you got the Cowboys, the Saints, the Broncos, the Chargers, and the Vikings. A lot of those games I think are favorable, maybe outside of that Vikings game. Then you end the season off with the Raiders, the Giants, the Commanders, and the Panthers. So I feel like this is a very favorable schedule that could easily see this Falcons team winning over 10 games, which is a huge step forward from where they've been at. However, coming in at number 3 is going to be the Chicago Bears. Now, similar to the Falcons, I had some very high expectations for this Bears team, and I would say so far they've lived up to those expectations pretty well. Currently, they sit in 4th place in the division, but they have a 4-2 record, so I don't feel like there's any harm in them being 4th when you've won 4 of the 6 games you've played this year. The NFC North is just ridiculously stacked. So far this year, they've put up 148 total points while only giving up 101. And statistically speaking, they rank 12th in points per game, 24th in yards per game, and number 8 in touchdowns per game. And defensively, they shine incredibly bright. They rank number 5 in opponents' points per game, number 7 in opponents' yards per game, and number 4 in opponents' touchdowns per game. Now, coming into this season, we all felt and knew that this was going to be one of the best defenses out there. End of the day, Matt Eberflus is a defensive-minded coach, and he has some incredible personnel. So we all knew and felt like this defense was going to be great, but it was just a question of when was Caleb Williams going to be able to acclimate to the NFL and play at a high level, and I would say so far he's starting to get to that point. Now, it started off admittedly really poor for Caleb. He obviously had that terrible performance in week 1 where they won the game, but it wasn't because of Caleb Williams. Then after that, he had a duel with CJ Stroud and got outplayed pretty severely. Then that Colts game of week 3, again, we started to see some strides, but it wasn't fully going. But since then, this team is on a 3-game winning streak, and Caleb Williams has looked good. They dropped 24 on the Rams, 36 against the Panthers, and most recently 35 against the Jaguars. Now again, similar to the Chargers, I think it's important that we do add some context because those 3 last teams I talked about are 3 of maybe the worst teams in the entire NFL. But for me, yes, those teams suck, but you want to see Caleb Williams take advantage of those terrible teams, and he's done that so far. He's gotten better week by week, and even though I don't think he's playing as highly as CJ Stroud did in his rookie season, or even Jaden Daniels, I feel like he's easily by far the 2nd best rookie quarterback, and is looking potentially like a top 20 level quarterback in the NFL. And for this Bears team, as long as you have that top 20-ish quarterback, your defense is definitely good enough to make you a playoff team. So all you need is this offense to not turn the ball over, not be horrendous, and you're going to be a great team. This is a Bears team that's going to have more opportunities later in the season to prove that they are a genuinely good team. They have the Commanders this week. They have the Cardinals, the Patriots, the Packers, the Vikings, and the Lions these next couple weeks. And then you're going to end the season off with tests against the 49ers, the Vikings, the Lions again, the Seahawks, and then you're going to end the year off with the Packers. So there is a chance that by the time we get to the end of the season, if this team somehow has won like 10 games more, then that's going to be an incredible look for this team because you've gone up against some of the NFL's best teams. And truthfully, even if this team were to win like 9 games this year, I don't think it's terribly a bad look because you've gone up against so many good teams. With that said, I do think this Bears team is going to have a shot against every single one of these teams because of how good that defense is. And with Caleb Williams getting more comfortable in this offense, and with guys like DJ Moore and Keenan Allen finally playing like how they should be, with Caleb getting him the ball more, I feel like this offense is good enough to win these games as well. So again, similar to Atlanta and LA, I don't think this is a Super Bowl contender, but I do feel like they have a chance to potentially make the playoffs, which if you had told me that at the beginning of the season, I would have said, yeah, that's a very improved team. That makes sense. However, moving on to number 2 and staying in the NFC North, we all know who I'm talking about. It's the Minnesota Vikings. They have been playing some really good football. They are currently 5-0, one of few undefeated teams in the NFL, and have been playing magnificently. So far this year, they've put up a total of 139 points this year while only giving up 76. And statistically, they rank number 6 in points per game, number 17 in yards per game, and number 6 in touchdowns per game. And defensively, similar to Chicago, this defense has been flat out awesome. They rank number 3 in opponents' points per game, number 14 in opponents' yards per game, and number 6 in opponents' touchdowns per game. Now, unlike a team like Chicago and a couple other of these teams I've talked about in this video, this Vikings team has been tested and has passed basically every test. In week 1, you obviously had a bit of a give-me game against the New York Giants, but then in week 2, you beat the 49ers. Then in week 3, you dominated the Houston Texans. Then in week 4, you beat the Green Bay Packers, and in week 5, you beat the Jets. And now, on Sunday, you have a really tough matchup against the Detroit Lions that I feel like is going to give this team, if they win, that much more confidence that they are maybe the best team in the NFL. And if they were to lose that game, I don't think there's any harm done, especially if it's a close matchup because Detroit is just a really good team. My expectations for this Vikings team coming into the season, I wouldn't say was very high. I thought they would come maybe 3rd or 4th in the division. I thought they would be a good and competitive team, but definitely not a contender or a championship contender or a playoff contender or anything like that. And that was because I felt like there was question marks on the defense, question marks along the offense, and some suspect players here and there. But so far this year, I've been completely wrong. Sam Darnold has taken over the quarterback position and has straight up dominated it. The running game has been sharp. The offensive line's been playing good. Jefferson and Addison are playing fantastic when they're healthy. And the defense is maybe the best defense in the league. I don't think that's a crazy thing to say. Because when you hold Brock Purdy to 17, CJ Stroud to 7, and yes, Jordan Love dropped 29, but a lot of that was in garbage later in the game type of time. So you've held 3 quarterbacks in check for the most part, and I feel like they're going to continue to do so. Again, my expectations for this Vikings team were fairly low, and they've completely lived up and dominated my expectations. The Vikings missed the playoffs last year, and I think that at this point, they're one of maybe a few teams that we might say are locks to make the playoffs, which is a huge step forward from where they were last year. And now it's gotten so good that there's actually some question marks about whether or not JJ McCarthy even has to be the quarterback of the future because of how good Sam Darnold is playing. Again, it's early in the season, so we'll wait until the offseason to even get into those conversations, but that's just how good they're playing right now. However, the Minnesota Vikings are not my number 1. You could easily put them at number 1, but to me, they're not as surprising as who my number 1 team is, and that is going to be the Washington Commanders. Now again, if you want to flip these teams or if you want to put Minnesota number 1, feel free to do so. I have no issue with that. But me personally, my expectations for Minnesota was that they would be a competitive and decent team. Whereas for Washington, I thought they'd be good and better, but not this much better. On the season, they rank number 1 in their division, have scored 178 points while giving up 145, have looked 10 times better than both the Eagles and the Cowboys, who were the frontrunners to win the division, quite frankly. And statistically speaking, everything backs it up as well, primarily on the offense. Offensively, they rank number 2 in points per game, number 5 in yards per game, and number 7 in touchdowns per game. And while defensively it hasn't been pretty, it's definitely been a bit of a step forward from last year. They rank number 22 in opponents' points per game, number 22 in opponents' yards per game, and number 25 in opponents' touchdowns per game. Now, those defensive stats aren't the prettiest, but again, this was arguably the worst defense in the NFL last year, so anything above 32, 30, 31 is a bit of a step forward for this Commanders team. Now again, similar to a couple teams, I do want to add a bit of context to these numbers and to their record so far, because I would say they've lost their 2 biggest tests so far this season, but they haven't looked bad, which is a huge step forward for this Commanders team. In week 1, you had your 2nd biggest matchup of the season so far against the Buccaneers, and even though you got dominated, you definitely looked like you belonged there and didn't get blown out. You lost by 17 to what is a Buccaneers team that is probably going to make the playoffs. So in a week 1 performance where Jaden Daniels is making his debut game, I don't think there's any harm there. But since that loss, after that you won 4 straight games against the Giants. You had that great matchup against the Bengals. You beat up on the Cardinals, and then you beat up on the Cleveland Browns. Now, again, 3 of those teams are some of the worst teams in the NFL, so we do have to add that context, but the offense is dropping 30 points left and right, and the defense is actually playing pretty well against against bad teams. Then in this most recent week, you had the Baltimore Ravens, and you were able to compete against this team. And if you had asked me last year, do I think this Commanders team can compete with the Ravens? I would have said, hell no, no way. This is the same Commanders team that got blown out by Dallas twice, was getting blown out by teams left and right, and they just had a competitive back and forth matchup where they could have won that game if they had a couple of things go their way against a Ravens team that I think is maybe the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 2nd, 1st best team in the league. Again, I don't want to overreact here. I don't think Washington is going to win a Super Bowl. I don't think they're going to go on some incredible playoff run. But I think they have a good chance of making the playoffs. And given the fact this is a team that had the number 2 overall pick last year, that is a huge step forward for this franchise and for this team in general. And when you look at the remainder of their schedule, it's not terribly difficult. Next week, you have the Panthers. You're going to win that game. Then you have the Bears, the Giants, the Steelers, the Eagles, the Cowboys, the Titans, the Saints, the Eagles again, and then we go the Falcons, the Cowboys. That is a very, very winnable schedule for this Commanders team. If anything, I look at the Bears game, that's going to be a tough one. I think they'll beat the Cowboys because the Cowboys look terrible so far. Those Eagles matchups are always close, and I think if the Eagles can't figure out their stuff, the Commanders could win those games. And while I don't expect them to go undefeated in these games, if they can win the majority of these games, which I think is very reasonable to say, then holy crap, this team is a 10+ win team compared to where they were last year. That is an incredible jump from what we've seen from this team. The biggest jump for me has been this offense. Last year, Sam Howell led the way, and that offense just wasn't good enough. It could put up some points here and there, but it was just turnover prone. Offensive line was terrible. They had no ground game. Receiving core was getting frustrated. And now this year, with basically one major change, which is Jaden Daniels, and yes, you added Tyler Biadasz, Austin Eckler, a couple other pieces, but mainly just Jaden Daniels has completely transformed this offense from one of the worst to one of the best offenses in the NFL. Again, adding the context to it, you've gone up against a bunch of bad teams and have dominated them and have lost against 2 of the better opponents on your schedule. But you've looked competitive, and you arguably could have won against the Ravens if a couple of things went your way. So I think we have to give respect to the Washington Commanders. Shout out to Jaden Daniels. That team is playing good. But per usual, if you guys did enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.